Hi, I'm Jamie Poisson. Every era has its defining industry. 1950s America was dominated by industrial workers and the automotive industry, for example. But now, nearly halfway through the 2020s, it appears as though the influencer economy may be our next defining frontier. As of today, there are reportedly 13 million full-time influencers in the United States. That is a remarkable 7% of the American workforce concentrated in a field of work many know little about. It feels like very quickly the term influencer transitioned from something ephemeral and negatively stigmatized socially as unserious to an international force that could go on to define the future of our economic and social lives.
Social media, I feel like, is like our new media outlet nowadays.
I absolutely believe my content is making it to undecided voters.
I would look at TikTok influencers in the fitness industry and kind of like feel like that's the kind of life I wanted to live.
So first, what does the term influencer even mean? Are these simply micro-celebrities manipulating strangers to buy things? Are they selling a lifestyle, advertising dollars? And who is their largest constituency? And have we officially entered an era predicted by the artist Andy Warhol half a century ago, who said, in the future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes? Emily Hund is the author of The Influencer Industry, The Quest for Authenticity on Social Media. And she's written for The Atlantic, The New York Times, and more about the influencer economy and the need to professionalize the industry before it's too late. Emily, hi. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Let's start with the simple stuff. A lot of our listeners will recognize terms like influencer and creator from their own lives. And I understand that these terms are kind of amorphous by nature. These are people often making content that can include everything, right? From getting ready with me videos to prank videos to mommy blogging to haul style videos after a day of shopping. But is there a central definition of what an influencer actually is?
So, for my purposes, I have always, for the purposes of my research, I should say, I have always thought of an influencer as a person who is creating content for social media in a strategic way, in hopes of getting either financial or reputational gain from it. So these are people who are like intentionally cultivating audiences, usually with the hope that they'll attract brand deals, or other professional opportunities.
I am currently in Ohio with Hollister. I thought it would be really fun to film a day in my life on a brand trip so that you guys can kind of see what it's like and just like see the whole rundown.
We got some packages, let's unbox them. Always open your packages with respect. Okay, let me chill. Got some slippers. First ones we got are shoe boxes. These look goofy, but they mad comfy.
Everyone and their moms are talking about the Patrick Ta eyeshadow palettes. These are $57 where I live. Not even Kylie Jenner, I've seen her talk about this, but she has a $24, it's called a wet shimmer quad, and I want to see if it's the same exact dupe.
There was a lot more, I guess I should say, coalescence around this definition earlier on in the earlier years of the industry, because there was such optimism and sort of fixation on this idea that was sort of new at the time of digital influence, and the idea that we could measure like how influential someone was and then correlate that to money. And so that is kind of where that term, I think, first got legs. And then over the last decade or so, it has become a little more slippery because the types of content people are creating has diversified so much. The platforms available, the ways people are getting paid, it's just become a lot less precise in some ways. And there has been this sort of push, both from some people on the inside as well as from platforms, I think, to reconceptualize these people as creators, which is a little less, I think it kind of obfuscates the strategy behind it a little bit. and works to centralize this idea that, we're just like passionate people doing what we love, having fun, connecting with people. And it kind of also, I think, encourages more people to, potentially see themselves under that umbrella.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, you've written that this entire industry is really an outgrowth of the 2008 financial crisis and a holdover from the blogging era of the early aughts. And essentially, then in 2008, millions of workers have been laid off and were now at home, and many found their way on social media. And just talk to me a bit about this moment and how it is in many ways responsible for today's landscape.
Yeah, so prior to the financial crisis, like you mentioned, blogs had been gaining steam.
What's happening, Forum? There really weren't a lot of good viral videos out this week, so I had to use some of last week's rejects, starting with this skater guy who does an amazing rail slide. Ouch! And let that be a lesson to you, Forum. Emo hair is not a good substitute for a safety helmet.
They were never, they never had the audiences that, social media would later bring. But there was this sort of like slowly growing idea that you could go online to publish your thoughts, opinions, reporting, creative production, whatever that may be, on a blog, and that you could find audiences there. And then, on the audience side, there was this sort of growing idea that bloggers were interesting and cool and, had like a perspective to offer that you weren't getting from other,
Mhm.
major
Mhm.
mainstream media outlets. And then when the financial crisis happened, that was a huge it was a huge moment, like a pivotal moment of both material change. So, like you mentioned, millions of people lost their jobs. People were at home, especially in the creative industries. There was a huge amount of pressure, I think, for people to turn to the internet to try to like keep themselves professionally afloat when they, while they were navigating their next steps. And then, even people outside the creative industries as well, this idea of like, oh, maybe I could create content for the internet and find my way out of this financial and professional situation that I'm in. So there was that moment of like material pressure, as well as like a pivotal moment, I think, more like existentially for people, where an economic crisis of that magnitude really forced many people to rethink their relationship to their work. There it was a moment of rupture as far as public trust in institutions and sort of the traditional modes of doing things. People understandably, when you're unceremoniously laid off or you lose your home or, all these things are understandably, they grow suspicious of these sort of narratives that they had
Mhm.
previously believed, whether it was about, what it meant to have a stable career, and that sort of thing. And so it was this moment where there was financial pressure to figure out your way out. And also I think people began to be more open in that moment to receiving that type of non-traditional content.
I would imagine that the pandemic might have also served as a pretty significant historical period in the arc of the story of the influencer. Would you agree with that? Just intuitively, I would think that.
Yeah. Oh, totally. And you can see this over like the sort of arc of the short-ish history of the influencer industry over the last 15 plus years or so. So we have like these major moments like the 2008 financial crisis, and then of course the pandemic. And in between, there are moments that are not quite as severe, but other moments where the industry has faced challenges. For example, like another sort of easy one to point to is in the late 2010s when there started to be a lot of public discussion suddenly about Facebook and, in the wake of like Cambridge Analytica
Mhm.
and then the whole Fire Festival fiasco, there all of a sudden there were like a few things happening in the public eye that started to sort of cause people to say like, what is going on here? And other moments like that. But every time over the course of the history of the industry that there has been a sort of like challenge, whether like an economic challenge or a cultural challenge to what was happening, the people working within the industry find a way to like expand, and they find a way to like continue to grow, continue to be successful even in the face of these challenges. And so that, of course, is what we saw happen in 2020. Again, this moment where lots of people are at home, of course, under very different circumstances, deep uncertainty, a moment of, again, existential uncertainty, material pressures, and the introduction of new platforms like TikTok. That's when
Yep.
TikTok really started to explode. And these moments of uncertainty almost always lead to the industry growing and becoming more successful. And I think it's because, I mean, there are a multitude of reasons for that, but in the most like meta sense, I think it's because the industry promises and has promised like since its founding that like this is a way to feel in control of your life. This is a way to feel secure and find fulfillment.
Let's fast forward to today. There are 13 million full-time influencers in the United States alone. That is 7% of the American workforce. According to Goldman Sachs, the influencer economy is worth around $250 billion, a number expected to double by 2027. And just, this is an industry already several orders of magnitude larger than the music industry. And how do you see these numbers? Do they strike you as tenable? Does this feel like a bubble likely to burst?
That's a good question. I sort of resist that narrative of like a bubble about to burst, only because, like I mentioned, the industry, there's been many moments before where people have thought,
Yeah.
okay, this is going to be it. Like we can't keep going. And like the industry finds a way to keep going. And so
It's like
I
Bitcoin
don't
and
think
Donald
that
Trump. And yeah, we could keep going. Yeah.
yeah. Right. And so I don't think it is going anywhere, especially, I guess, to be more precise, the thing that I don't think is going anywhere is this practice of people cultivating audiences online through strategically produced content and then using those audiences, leveraging the eyeballs that they get for financial and
Mhm.
reputational gain. So that very basic practice of being an influencer or a creator, I don't think is going anywhere. Now, the platforms, might change, the formats might change, but this practice, I think, is here to stay for better or worse.
This is still a pretty nascent industry, right? Which hasn't really had the time to mature or professionalize in lockstep with all of that growth. And because of that, this is all kind of a wild west where there's little regulation, oversight, standardization. And I know that you've written that the industry is a global force that, quote, sometimes behaves like a ramshackle startup with little professional cohesion and inconsistent consequences for unfair play. And just talk to me a bit about what you mean by that and what you think should happen.
So, the most obvious example of like the uneven consequences are the ways in which, particularly in the United States, which that's where I'm based and that's where my research was done. So that's again, for better for worse, where most of my examples come from. But for example, this idea that the FTC tends to target like super celebrities, mega influencers when they run afoul of transparency regulations. So we've seen, people like Kim Kardashian get targeted multiple times, Lindsay Lohan, people like that,
Yeah.
recognizable names that, they'll go after these people and, make a public example of them, I think in hopes of the fear then trickling down to less famous influencers, and to sort of like remind them like, oh, there are regulations that, you need to be transparent when you have a material relationship with a brand, and things like that, because it's just impossible to actually oversee all of this content that's flooding
Mhm.
social media every day. Like, I don't even know how you would do that. So that's what I mean by the uneven consequences. And
And
so,
sorry, and just for clarity, like when you say they're running afoul of regulations, like can you just give me an example?
yeah, so basically there are regulations in place that require people to make their material relationships with brands, like
Right.
it has to be clearly and
Like this post is
conspicuously disclosed.
sponsored by Skims. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, and the line is clear and conspicuous, so you have to be really upfront about the fact that, this brand has paid you, or this brand supplied, this outfit you're wearing, and so anything that's vague, like just like a hashtag thanks, or like, that kind of thing, that does not pass muster. Um and so, yeah, but it's really impossible to oversee all of that. And so the industry is really reliant on, brands wanting to make it a priority because, maybe they're afraid of, the FTC targeting them. Um, and influencers don't really have, it's not like there's professional onboarding for when you become an influencer. And
Yeah,
so
they're like, here's
influencers,
the HR department. This is yeah.
right. And so influencers, especially because a lot of these people are young, they're not always like informed about the fact that there actually are rules that they're supposed to be following. Um, and so a lot of influencers just aren't informed, or, it's very easy to, be informed, but just choose not to comply, because it is unlikely, unless you are very famous, it's unlikely that you're going to get called out. And I I often think back to like prior media
Yeah.
industries, it's um, you know, industries like, newspapers, television, the advertising industry. There was a time in history where all of these industries were new. And audiences, people, the citizens, as well as the professionals who were creating these industries, like there had to be negotiations really about what do we want this to be? What is the social role? And how are we going to, try to make that vision a reality? And I think it's well past time that the influencer industry do such a thing.
I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about that. It's something that I've thought about a lot. We've talked about it a lot on this team, this idea that these influencers, they're the vanguard of this new moment in media and journalism, one where people might feel like disillusioned by the mainstream press, and they seek their news from influencers whose voice they trust, as opposed to from people like me, right?
Mhm.
And there are real implications to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do have to follow a lot of rules as a journalist. I cannot take really anything, be paid for anything outside this job. I think there are good reasons for that, but there have been examples in the influencer industry that have really created a lot of problems, right? I wonder if you could tell me about the one with Shein, just to kind of illustrate this point.
Yeah. So that was a big kind of hullabaloo about a year or so ago, where Shein, which is the massive fast fashion retailer based in China, they sell items for like beyond bargain basement prices. Like, we're talking
Yeah.
like $5 for a shirt, kind of thing. And social media is like a huge, driver of sales for them. And they've seen, tremendous growth in North America in the last few years. But there has been a lot of criticism of Shein, saying, questioning, their pricing, and how are these goods actually being made? What's the labor conditions in the factories? Like, what's really going on here? And so they decided to sponsor an influencer trip
This China trip has been one of the most life-changing trips of my life. Getting to see the whole process of Shein clothing from beginning to end with my own 2 eyes was so important. I was really excited and impressed to see the working conditions. The biggest takeaway from this trip is to be an independent thinker, get the facts, and see it with your own 2 eyes.
They paid for a bunch of influencers to come over. They gave them a tour of some of their buildings. Again, like they said, it was a factory tour and all this, and everything was beautiful, and the workers were happy and all of that. And then the influencers post all this content. Look, I'm at Shein. Like,
And it's
it's
great.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, like this is amazing. But then there was, understandably a huge backlash to this influencer trip, and people saying like, you just got taken for a ride, like this was staged, like, people were, not buying what the
Yeah.
influencers were saying.
Although I do worry that it's still out there, right? This is the kind of stuff that I guess gets me more as a journalist, that people still saw it. We talked about how this is 7% of the American workforce now. And I really want to talk to you about the fact that this is especially so for school-age children. There is a lot of data out there which shows that a huge percentage of American youth desire to be YouTubers or influencers. I would imagine it's not very different in Canada. And it has gotten to the point where parents are now sending their children to so-called creator camps where kids can learn these skills necessary to become successful online creators. And what do you make of the appeal that all of this has on children? And what might you say to parents that feel, very uncomfortable about all of it?
Yeah. So on the one hand, I think it's totally understandable why kids are attracted to this. Again, this is an industry that since the beginning has portrayed itself as being all about like fun, following your passions, getting paid for it, getting all this great free stuff. But the difference is, I think with prior generations, like the hurdles were higher and more obvious. So, if a kid was like, "Oh, I want to be a rock star," like a
Yes.
lot of parents would be like, "Okay, yeah, sure," like, good luck with that, and let me tell you about all the reasons why I think that's a bad idea.
Yes.
And in this case, it's kind of like,
Grab
well,
your
yeah,
iPhone and a ring light and you're good to go, right? Yeah.
yeah, like, well, I guess we could give it a try. Like, you never know.
Yeah, and I think also you make one video that goes viral. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I understand like the pressure that parents might feel too, where it's like, oh, my kid is telling me this is, his or her dream. And like, what if they could really do it? Who am I to stand in the way, maybe, or something? But I will say that I think, over time, most adults have become pretty well versed in the pitfalls of being a child star, whether, working in Hollywood or a musician or, things like that. People have become aware of the problems associated with that. And I would like to, like, I think it's worth saying that there are a lot of similar risks of trying to make it as an influencer as a child, if not heightened risks, because again, there's very little barriers, and so the feedback that you're getting from the audience is immediate and delivered to you personally instead
Yeah.
of your manager in Los Angeles or whoever, and so the perils, I think, are heightened and much more apparent. Um, and we also don't have like our laws haven't caught up to this as a form of labor. And so in the US, and I think in many countries there are laws protecting, child performers, requiring they only work a certain amount of hours,
Yes.
making
Yeah.
sure that they're getting tutored or attending a certain amount of schooling, protecting their financial interests, a certain amount of their earnings have to go into a trust, that sort of thing. We just don't have that. It's coming along. Like some states in the US have started to pass laws, and I know, there are discussions happening,
Yeah,
but we
but
have
few
not
and far
followed.
between, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
I'll just note for our listeners, we did an episode looking at the harms that have been caused by this, children who have really struggled with it. And I'll drop that link in our show notes if people want to go back and listen. It was really interesting. Final question for you, Emily. We've talked about what influencers are, the need to professionalize this nascent industry. But, I wanted to end this conversation by asking you about something else that I have been thinking about. We've been thinking about a lot is what do you think our abiding need for influencers, the fact that this industry even exists at all, say about us as a people, right? What does this desire for a more personalized entertainment experience say about the moment that we find ourselves in today, about the way our consumer or viewer habits have changed?
I think that people are overwhelmed. And I think this has been apparent to me for years. In the course of doing my research, it's been apparent for a long time that I think people are really overwhelmed in today's world. Like it's information overload. It's like everything overload. And so I think in some ways influencers solve like a very practical problem for people, which is again that shopping aspect.
Yes.
Where, when you are just like inundated with so much advertising, so many choices for every, you can spend your whole life trying to decide like what toothbrush to buy.
Yeah. Or you can listen to someone who's great at toothbrushes tell you, or you think is great at toothbrushes, tell you what toothbrush to buy, or what sweater from Zara to buy. Or I get that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think in that like really practical way, like they serve a purpose for people that's like kind of utilitarian. And it's like, if I can find a person out there who seems kind of like me, who I feel like I relate to, and they can tell me what toothbrush they bought and like what boots they bought for winter, and I'm just going to copy their choices because it's going to make my life easier. And so I think that's part of it. And then, again, it speaks to like these timeless themes of like human existence, of like our need for connection, our need to feel safe and secure, and our need to feel like we have some measure of control over our lives. I think the industry like really speaks to all those things, because even as, inauthentic or surface level as these relationships can be at times, they offer a feeling that a lot of people are missing in their everyday lives. And so I think it just really speaks to like these really timeless human needs. And, the industry has just found a way to sort of give people what they're, tap into what people desire.
Emily, this is great. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
All right, that is all for this week. I'm Jamie Poisson. Thanks so much for listening. Front Burner was produced by Joytha Shen-Gupta, Matt Amha, Matt Muse, Ali Janes, Kieran Odshorn, and Aja Sauter. Sound design was by Mackenzie Cameron and Marco Luciano. Music is by Joseph Shabison. Our senior producer is Elaine Chow. Our executive producer is Nick McCabe-Locos. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll talk to you on Monday.